Konnichiwa, Pakusei-tachi. I'm Puppy-Sensei, the puppy girl Japanese teacher VTuber of Irium US. I make Japanese language content to help you level up your abilities. For today's lesson, we're going to be taking a little look at Kansai-ben, the dialect of Japanese most commonly spoken in the Kansai region of Japan. Before we get into our lesson, though, I want to tell you that this is actually a fan-requested episode. I am not a specialist in the Kansai dialect. I have lived in 3 different cities in the Kansai area. Nara, where I went to school, Ishida, a suburb of Kyoto, and Tenri, where I briefly studied one of Japan's interesting, smaller religious movements. I therefore have some exposure to Kansai-ben, but at no level where I would consider myself particularly well-versed. And that's okay! Before writing the script for this episode, I spent some time doing research into Kansai-ben and freshening up my skills so I could present to you high-quality information. It is my humble opinion that teachers make the best students, but only when we're willing to admit what we don't know and soak up that knowledge so that we can pass it on to our students. All that's to say that you should consider this an imperfect primer into the Kansai dialect. Let's get into it! Ikimashou! I like to start these long-form lessons with a kanji breakdown, but for today, I want to do something else first. Let's look at a map of Japan together and really think about what we mean when we start talking about a dialect. This is a dialect map of Japan. As we look at this map, I want us to be very intentional about what the map is actually showing us. Look up at Hokkaido. The whole of Hokkaido is shaded to indicate that the Hokkaido dialect is spoken there. But we should be very careful to avoid absolutism. Does that mean that if you go to Hokkaido and start speaking like a Shikoku native, nobody will understand you? Absolutely not. The difference between a dialect and a language is that languages are not mutually intelligible. Dialects are mutually intelligible, meaning that for the most part, speaking different dialects is highly unlikely to result in situations where you're not understood by the locals just because your dialect isn't the one spoken by the majority in the area that you're visiting. Likewise, we need to understand that these are not physical borders. There's no magical line that you can cross, at which you can reliably say, "Oh ho ho, I've crossed into the Tohoku region. Time to pull out my Tohoku dialect dictionary." Dialect diffusion, the way a dialect moves through space, who uses it, and where, and when, and how, is notoriously difficult to track. I should know. I'm a dialectologist. The point is that a dialect is basically just a fancy way of thinking about the interesting peculiarities spoken by a local population within some area. It can include word choice, accent, and even meta-linguistic factors, such as how animated you are with your hands while you talk. Dialect can be deeply tied into a person's sense of personal identity. So when we study a dialect in a new language, as we're going to do today, it's my personal belief that our focus should be on learning to listen for the unique qualities of a dialect for the purpose of understanding others when they speak, and not necessarily for the purpose of affecting a dialect so that we can sound like a native. Sounding like a native is great, and it's a wonderful aspiration, but I think it's a mistake to adopt some dialect of your non-native language and then proudly proclaim, "This is my dialect now." I don't know. I don't think a dialect is a thing that you can learn from a book. That's not how language works. Okay, I'm off my soapbox. Let's take a last look at our map here and notice what we're not seeing. There's no Kansai-ben on this list. And that's because another name for the Kansai region is the Kinki region. Har har. You're going to hear Kansai way more often than you hear Kinki. Kinki is sort of the official or legislative name of the region, but basically, we're talking about specifically this part of Japan that we see here. Major cities in the Kansai region include Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, and Nara, among others, and yes, all these are cities where you might hear Kansai dialect spoken, and you might not. You might hear what we think of as standard Japanese, which is really the Tokyo dialect or the Kanto dialect. I think this is especially true if you're a tourist in Japan. People who meet you on the street are much more likely not to greet you in a non-standard dialect if you know, don't look like you live there. But if you're traveling or living in this region of Japan, there's every likelihood that you're going to come in contact with Kansai-ben at some point. So let's learn a bit about it today. Appropriately, we need to start by learning the word Kansai-ben itself. Kansai-ben, meaning the Kansai dialect. I'm actually fascinated by the names of regions of Honshu and how often they're just so purely descriptive. Like, Tohoku means northeast, because that's where it is. And the Kansai and Kanto regions both mean west of the barrier and east of the barrier, respectively. What barrier? Well, that's interesting. During the Tokugawa era, there was a toll gate in Hakone. So basically, the Kansai region was the area to the west of that barrier, and the Kanto region was the area to the east of that barrier. I find that historically fascinating. So let's actually dive into these kanji and really understand them deeply. Here is the kanji card here. So based on what I already told you, we know that the kan from Kansai-ben can mean something like a gateway or a barrier, but it can also relate to having some kind of connection to something. It's used in the verb kakawaru, which can mean things like meddling in something, or getting your hands dirty in some certain matter or affair. Maybe particularly if you don't have business being involved in it. Kakawaru is an intransitive verb, meaning it doesn't take a direct object, so you can use it to discuss getting yourself involved in things. We'll also see the kanji kan in the word genkan, which is the room in a Japanese house where you take off your shoes. Usually. Not every house has one. The second kanji in Kansai-ben means west. In some cases, it can be used in the word for Spain, but not in the same way that it's also used as the su in a lot of country names. I won't get into that too much. Usually, when we see this kanji, we're going to be thinking about the word west, western direction, yeah? And when we see some examples in terms here like seireki, that means like the years AD, or Taiseiyo, the Atlantic Ocean. We should definitely be thinking about how those things relate to the West, right? The last kanji that we see in Kansai-ben is this ben kanji. This is a wild one. It's clearly got a very diverse set of meanings. I've said before that a lone kanji is very often the broadest of all possible meanings. It can mean a lot of things. Kanji really derive both meaning and pronunciation from an interplay between the other kanji that they appear with. It's their kanji compounds that we really see kind of pronunciation take root and also meaning kind of shine out, right? And so when we look at just one lone kanji, more often than not, we're seeing kind of all of the possible things that it could mean. So the ben in bento can be the same ben in bengoshi, which can be the same ben in Kansai-ben. And that's pretty wild. I find it fascinating. So yeah, Kansai-ben is just the specific dialect that we hear spoken in the Kansai region. So let's work together today to learn a bit of Kansai-ben. The first thing that you should know about Kansai-ben is that it's got a reputation for being very comedic. Comedy duos are very popular in the Kansai region, particularly Osaka. And for that reason, I think people often talk about the Kansai dialect as being or sounding funny. Not sounding funny as in, ew, it sounds funny when you say that. Not weird, but literally tied to comedy. Like, imagine, if you would, that some of the most famous American comedians ever came from Boston. Just using this as an example. I don't necessarily believe that. You can see my opinions in the picture. But up and coming comedians might emulate the Bostonian accent because they want to sound similar to some very famous Bostonian comedians, right? And over time, what you would see happening is kind of the image in your head that comedians sound funnier when they talk in a Bostonian accent because you're thinking about these actually very funny people that you know of that speak in that accent, and that kind of makes you think about these other things that are funny. And then when you hear the Bostonian accent, you go, ah, that clearly reminds me of comedy. That's a little bit of what's going on with the Kansai dialect. The reason that this happened is the association that Osaka has with a form of spoken word comedy called manzai. Manzai comedy is usually a two-man act with one straight man and one funny man, and they trade rapid-fire jokes and barbs. Manzai is often performed in Kansai-ben purely because of its popularity in Osaka. And so if you think about that, a lot of this very funny comedy is being performed in Kansai-ben, and so over time, Kansai-ben has developed this reputation of being, ah, I remember that little dialect, that sounds funny to me. Either because of this reputation or in spite of it, a lot of phrases in Kansai-ben just kind of sound playful. I tend to associate Kansai-ben with playfulness. And I think that culturally, the Kansai region maybe shares this reputation for kind of like a vibrancy that contrasts with a salaryman Tokyo aesthetic. It's not as hustle and bustle. Kansai is a place where you feel like you can lean back and relax. You're not as harried and rushed. But that's just my judgment. So, what are you likely to hear in Kansai-ben that sounds distinct from standard Japanese? We'll start with honma. Honma. I like this a lot. It reminds me of a movie that I like that, for a whole variety of reasons, I cannot in good conscience recommend to you. But yes, in the Kansai region, you might hear honma. Spoken as a question, it means, chat, is this real? You can also just say like honma-ja or honma desu, which means yeah, exactly, that's the case. You can use honma as an intensifier, like honma ni aho ya na. You're really an idiot. I think of aho as being a little bit of a softer version of baka. To me, I actually find baka to be a bit more direct and offensive, but in a lot of anime, you're going to see aho translated as asshole. And I think that's really funny because in the Kansai region, I think aho gets thrown around a whole lot as just kind of like, you dope. In Tokyo, this sentence would probably be something more like, 本当にバカだね. And what we're seeing here in ほんまにアホやな, this ya na is a common way to say da ne in Kansai-ben. Basically, anywhere that you could use honto, as in honto desu ka, or hontoni, you can use homma. Ne? And that little ya we were talking about before, that is very important to Kansai-ben. As we already know, da is the basic Japanese casual copula. It's used to equate two things in conversation, casually. Something is something. This is this. These things are what they are. That's da, or des if you're feeling polite. Now, I'm not saying that when you speak Kansai-ben you need to be impolite, but basically anytime you could use da in a Japanese sentence, you can replace it with ya, and you're well on your way to sounding like a native Kansai-ben speaker. So, これは大阪城だ. That would be, this is Osaka Castle in standard Japanese, and it can become これは大阪城や. It's that easy. And maybe you want to turn your sentence into a past tense sentence. That's also easy. Yatta! By which I mean the ending ya in the past tense. Not like yatta for good. So we get これは大阪城やった. Uh-oh. Who exploded the castle? Japanese has a lot of ways to express your thanks. ありがとうございます. お世話になりました. Thank you. ご苦労様. In Kansai, you might hear おおきに. It's actually an abbreviation of おおきにありがとう, which is basically big appreciate, large appreciation. But in conversation, it's really common to hear this abbreviated to おおきに. You hear this all the time in like Osaka in particular, I think. おおきに. Thanks. It can also follow a verb with てくれて to express your thanks for having had something done for you. For example, ようやくしてくれておきに. ね。ようやくしてくれておきに. Basically, this is kind of like thanks for making a reservation. And to form this type of thank you for doing something specific, you put your verb in the te form, and then you add the verbal suffix くれる. くれる is then put into the te form as くれて, and then おきに follows it. くれる basically means to take the trouble to do. So, 予約してくれておきに means thank you for taking the time to make a reservation. おきに, when used as thanks in this way, isn't particularly formal. So you'll usually hear it in shops or among friends. But in fact, a lot of Kansai-ben isn't all that formal because, well, as I said, the Kansai area is really quite laid back. Okay, so this one threw me off a little bit. Naze and nande? I'll be honest, before I did any research for this episode, I could not have told you that nande was not perfectly standard Japanese. I use it all the time. I hear it all the time. But apparently, technically, naze is kind of the more accepted standard dictionary Japanese way to ask why. The reality is, I never use naze. I very, very, very rarely use it. I use nande all the time, but nande really isn't specifically Kansai-ben either. Like I said, you hear nande all the time as a word for why or how come. However, what you surely might hear in Kansai that you may not hear in other parts of Japan is Nande ya nen? Nande ya nen? We're going to come back to this nen in a moment, but yeah, you'll hear Nande ya nen. It's a pretty extreme reaction to some kind of shocking news. What the hell? It can also be a lamentation like, oh, come on. Nande ya nen? But yeah, let's think about that nen. En. Nen is a suffix ending in Kansai-ben that is used for emphasis. Which is why nande ya nen is always some kind of like pretty extreme reaction. Because the nen here implies some like decisive emphasis or real enthusiasm or shock. You hear nen quite often in the Kansai region. Again, not a particularly formal or business-like use of the form. To me, it always brings back to mind the song Enen by the band The Yulefuls, Urufurus in Japanese. Apparently, the name Urufurus was supposed to come from the word soulful. They're a band from Osaka, and Enen itself means something like it's okay, emphatic. Okay, so let me be honest. The Urufurus are an old band. A very old band. Enen is an old song. That song came out in 2003. If that song was a person, it could buy alcohol. And as much as I appreciate in place of e for good in Kansai region, because that's what we see very, very often, is instead of e, as we would hear in standard Japanese, we hear それはいい. That's good. You might hear それはいいね. However, in my humble opinion, you don't actually hear being used very often among young people in the Kansai region these days. It's, it's an older person term nowadays. And that's maybe a bit of the problem, because these days you do somewhat feel that a dialect isn't really something that you always think about being super popular with the younger crowd. Especially when you think about how connected we all are these days. Internet make everyone speak same. You'll also sometimes hear used in the phrase de, which takes the place of the standard Japanese phrase iyo. Iyo means it's good, so ede also means it's good. If it was very, very good, you might say mecha ede. Mecha mecha omoshiroi. Mecha means a whole lot, very. Again, in Kansai, you hear mecha, well, mecha nandomo, really often. I am really interested in reduplication. It's something that I really enjoy learning about in linguistics. And you can do this in Kansai-ben, particularly with mecha. So you can say mecha mecha to kind of intensify the effect. So if mecha kawaii is very cute, then mecha mecha kawaii is very, very cute. We can quibble about whether or not you can say mecha 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 kawaii or not. I'm currently not taking a stance on this at this time. In standard Japanese, you'll often hear sugoi or takusan or sometimes even chou to talk about something being super much of something, like chou kakoi, ultra cool. But in my opinion, mecha kakkoi sounds pretty neat too. Kansai-ben pretty frequently drops sounds, making many terms that are just a little bit smaller. Examples are here. Muzukashii. The adjective for difficult will sometimes be pronounced muzui in Kansai-ben. Instead of hayaku, meaning quickly, in Kansai you might hear hayo. The one I really like is chao, meaning wrong. There's a whole Kansai joke that goes like this. Are? Chao chao chao. Chao 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 chao. Basically it means, that's a chow chow, as in the dog breed, isn't it? Because chow, as in wrong. But it can also be used in a way that's similar to ne in standard Japanese, right? And then the other person would respond, chow chow, that's wrong. Chow 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 cha. That's not a chow chow. Roll on snare. Everyone laughs. Hilarious. Basically, you can use chow as an abbreviation of janai, and you can also use it as a shortened version of chigao. So it can both mean janai and also chigao. Chigao becomes chow. And then we get sayonara in Kansai as the version of sayonara from standard Japanese. However, as I've said before, I never really use sayonara because it has the air of finality to it. We've learned a lot of replacement terms today in this lesson, but there are a couple of ways that Kansai-ben has some unique grammatical forms as well. It's worth looking at least one. So for today, we're just going to look at the verb conjugation of hen in Kansai-ben. Yeah? So what is hen? In standard Japanese, when you're forming the negative form of a verb, you can conjugate that verb into the nai form, right? And that negates the verb. But in the Kansai area, you often instead are going to hear verbs negated with the hen form that we're going to learn today. It means the exact same thing as the nai form. It's just hen. Let's look at a few examples. Okay, so here we're seeing asobu, the verb meaning to play. And asobanai would be the nai form, meaning don't play. So asobanai in standard Japanese would become asobahen in Kansai. Don't play. Asobahen. Remember, for any godan verb, you need to change the sound of the final vowel before you add nai, right? So asobu becomes asoba nai. And likewise, this carries over to the hen form. So it's asoba hen. Okay? Hen is going to work that exact same way. Basically, anytime you could form a nai verb, you can replace nai with hen, more or less. And of course, it's going to work the same way with any ichidan verb, right? So miru becomes minai, minai becomes mihen. It's just that easy. Yeah? We can always replace the nai in minai or any other ichidan verb with hen. Yeah? The only thing is, when it comes to irregular verbs, well, there's a lot of variation. There are so many options. Konai and shinai are the negations of our irregular verbs kuru and suru. And there are tons of hen forms for these verbs, right? We can see the list here. I'm not even going to go through all of these, but basically the hen form of an irregular verb is going to change based on a ton of factors. Your age, your hometown, etc., etc. Forming the past tense of a hen verb is as easy as adding kata to the end of it. So, I didn't eat would end up looking like this. Taberu becomes tabehen, right? And we know that it becomes tabehen because taberu would be tabenai in standard Japanese. Replace the nai with hen, and we get tabehen, to not eat. And then didn't eat would just add a kata to the end of that. So we get tabehen kata, didn't eat. Now, this isn't the only way to form the past tense of the hen form, but we're not going to go through the other one. I will say that this hen kata does feel a little bit more standard than the somewhat more antiquated other options, in my opinion. Once you know how to use this hen negation form, you can slot it into any sentences where you would otherwise want to use the nai form. Just like this. メネジャー様からなんか聞こえへんかったか? Manager 様からなんか聞こえへんかったか? Perfectly Kansai poi sentence. This is the kind of sentence you might hear if you were in Osaka and you hadn't heard anything from Manager sama in a while. I think they're probably drooling over takoyaki. Now, there are a few final thoughts that I want to leave you with before we end this lesson. First, actually there are even distinctions within the Kansai dialect too. In truth, the Kansai dialect, what we think of as the Kansai dialect, is actually a collection of other dialects. There are other dialects that kind of work together to make up the Kansai dialect. The Kansai dialect that you hear in Kyoto is slightly different than the Kansai dialect that you would hear in Kobe, which itself is slightly different from the Kansai dialect that you would hear in Osaka. This is why we actually also talk about Osaka-ben. However, because Osaka is the biggest city in the Kansai region, what we think of as Kansai-ben really is kind of synonymous with what is spoken in Osaka. So most of what I've taught you today really kind of relates quite directly to the way that you would hear people speaking in Osaka. However, we can think about something like this, right? There are ways to say things in standard Japanese that are going to be different from the way you say it in Osaka, or the way you would hear it in Kyoto, or the way you might say it in Kobe. Nani shiteru desu ka would be a way in standard Japanese to say, what are you doing? Right? So, if you were in Tokyo, you might hear, Nani shiteru desu ka? And it's also pretty standard. Fairly dictionary, with the exception of maybe that little at the end of shiteru. Eh? But in Osaka, you might hear, Nani shiten? Nani shiten? That carries more of a vibe of like, what's up to? Right? It sounds very casual. It sounds very friendly, but it also just sounds very Osaka-poi. It sounds like something you would hear in Osaka. In Kyoto, you might hear, Nani shite haru? Nani shite haru? And in Kobe, you might hear, Nani shito? I didn't spend too much time today talking about the very subtle differences in Kansai-ben that exist between these various cities. But if people are interested, maybe I could do an entire lesson on Nara and kind of Nara-ben one of these days. Nara really feels like home to me, so yeah. Nara-ben sounds funny to me because I think of it just as Kansai-ben, but yes, there are interesting ways that we speak in Nara, and maybe I could talk about that if people are interested. I'm also not talking about pitch accent in this lesson. Pitch accent is something that I also don't feel extremely qualified to teach. And in Kansai-ben, the truth is that pitch accent is even more pronounced than it is in standard Japanese. We're often taught that standard Japanese is meant to be spoken at a flat, even level, with very little emphasis or variation between words. It's not true, especially in conversational Japanese. Conversational Japanese ebbs and flows and changes and moves, particularly with emotion. But I really believe that for most speakers, pitch accent is almost something that you intuit. It's something that I find difficult to teach because it almost feels like it's a natural part of language that just kind of comes with time as you speak. I will eventually do some kind of lesson on pitch accent, or at a minimum, I'll put out some kind of video addressing my thoughts on it. Like and subscribe and do all of that stuff, and I'm sure that at some point you'll notice that I'm doing something on pitch accent. Anyway, the other thing that I want to say, this might be my closing remark on Kansai-ben. What we think of as standard Japanese really is not all that standard at all. Even in Tokyo, there are dialectal affects that you wouldn't consider traditionally as the right and proper way to speak Japanese. As a linguist, I fall into a camp of people who are called descriptivists. I'm interested in the way people do speak, and not the way people are supposed to speak. To me, grammar is only interesting as a tool through which we can understand how language actually works. But the moment that you start telling me, you're not supposed to say ain't, or don't use y'all because it's not a real word, you lose my interest. All words aren't real. Language is made up. We made it up. There is nothing natural about language. So I think people should keep that in mind if they want to take lessons from me. Because, like, I'm never going to be the right girl to teach you textbook Japanese. Instead, I try my best to teach my students the Japanese that you would really hear people using in real life. But what I can always promise you is that if I don't know something, I'll learn it. I like learning things. That's why I became a teacher. So that's all from me today. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson on Kansai-ben. I'll see you soon. Mata ne!
Thanks for watching. I'm glad you watched until the end. You can find my other content here. Also, it would make me really happy if you would check out jinxedgaming.com. If you're into zero-calorie gaming fuel and Oshi cups, you will love their products. Puppy-Sensei recommends the tangy strawberry flavor. It's so yummy. Remember to use code SENSEI at checkout for 10% off your order. Can't wait to see you next time. Mata ne!